Norman, I'm going to have you introduce our friend Giora.
What a pleasure. So the formal introduction is that Giora is our CML person. He is the co-founder of the CML Advocates Network, and he is the director of the Israeli CML Patients Organization. But on a much more important note, Giora Sharf is my friend. We go back many, many years, have been in many meetings together, and each of us knows whether we're CML or whether it's just, if we need something, you pick up the phone and the other one is there. So my good friend, Giora.
Thank you very much, my friend Norman. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm sure that we'll touch both of us on this, that the CML and the GIST community go back many years together. I think from the days that Glivec came out at the beginning of the 2000 years, and it was a miracle drug, I think, for both of us, for the CML community and also for the GIST community. So I think that was at the beginning of our friendship, which goes now, I think, almost 20 years back. So I'm really honored to be here and to be invited by the Life of Guft and Norman. When I look at the participant list, I see many of my close friends, which are here also. For example, Viji from India, or Elo Mapelo from Kenya. Hi, Elo. Thanks for hosting me when I came to organize CML Horizon in Nairobi, Kenya, a couple of years ago. Sylvia, of course, from Guatemala, and Jose, Costa Rica. Many of my good friends who are members of our CML Advocate Network are also part of the GIST community. So that shows how strong are the ties that both communities have together. So today, when I was asked to talk about what happened in the CML community in the last 20 years, I think I'll start with a slide of my personal story because it's kind of reflects the revolution that happened in the CML story in the last 20 years. So I call my story From Darkness to Light. You see on the left the dark, and then on the right you see the light starting to come out. And I was diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia, which is shortly called CML, beginning of 2000. I was lucky enough to join IRIS trial, which was the phase 3 trial for the approval of Glivec, imatinib, as a first-line drug for CML, with Dr. Hochhaus in Germany. And you ask me, why did I go to Germany? And the answer is simple. Access to clinical trial. We know that clinical trials are not run in most of the countries in the world, and at that time it was not run in Israel, so I had to find a place where I can join it. I almost came to the US, to Dr. Brian Drucker, who invented the imatinib in Glivec, but I ended up in a closer place with a very good doctor called Andreas Hochhaus, at that time in Mannheim in Germany. You know, the trial was had two arms. One of them was Glivec, the new drug, but the other one was interferon combined with chemotherapy. And I was unlucky to get drawn to the interferon arm, which I took for 7 months with many side effects. And the outlook was not so good. If you ask the doctor who diagnosed me, I was told I have 3, maximum 5 years to live. And we are talking about 2000. Now it's been almost 22 years, and unfortunately the doctors who told me that I have 3 to 5 years to live, they are not with us anymore, and we, the CML patients, are still here. So after 7 months of suffering, from side effects to the interferon, I finally was switched to the STI 571 at that time, today known as Glivec or imatinib. And actually, my life has changed completely at that day. If you asked me at that time if I would have imagined that I'll be here 22 years later, living and kicking and doing things, probably I would have never dreamt about it. But I decided to live my life by setting personal goals, one after other one. One of my sons, I have three sons and one daughter. One of my sons was 12 years old, and all I wanted is to live and see him for his bar mitzvah in 1 year. And then after that, I wanted to see my oldest son get enlisted to the army and released. So I went from one target, from one goal to another one. And I must admit that in the last 22 years, I have achieved dreams and goals that I never dreamed I would. Today, I have three of my children are married. I have 5 grandchildren and 2 more on the way, coming in few months. So I consider myself to be a very lucky and very happy man. Within 9 months of starting Glivec, I became PCR negative. PCR is a test that is being used to monitor the level of response to the treatment in CML. And PCR negative is actually when you don't see any sign of the disease in the blood test, in the PCR. Today it's usually PCR used, to monitor COVID-19, but at that time we used to do it for CML mainly and other diseases. And I kept this deep molecular response for 13 years. And in June 2014, more than 7 years ago, together with my doctor, we decided to stop my treatment to see if I'm kind of cured. And actually, for the last 7+ years, I have been without any treatment, what we call TFR, treatment-free remission, with my deep molecular response is being kept on all the PCR tests that I am doing, and we must do and continue to do this testing because we know it's not a cure. And I think at the beginning of that story, I decided that if I would get to live, I will use my experience to help other CML patients in my country, in Israel, and also globally. So CML is in a quite good situation today, and we say that the sky is blue, but it's not completely blue. There are still quite many clouds in the sky, and those clouds are challenges that CML patients face until today. And if I just list a few of them, you see adherence, and I'll talk about adherence in a minute, non-adherence actually to treatment, which is quite a question that everybody can ask himself. How come that a patient who can take a drug and save his life and live quite a normal life for many years is not taking the drugs that is saving him? So that's a good question, but we see that about 30-35% of CML patients are not taking the drug as prescribed to them by their doctor. There is still a percentage of patients who develop resistance to the treatment and relapse, and we need to find treatment option for them. Special cases like young CML, even though CML is a disease of average age 55, 60 and above at the diagnosis, still there are also youngsters. In my Israeli group, about 20% of the patients are below 40. So pregnancy and family planning is a big issue for them, especially as you cannot take TKI like Glivec or other ones that we have today while you are pregnant. Questions of generics and substandard drugs coming in different countries, different regions in the world are also a big issue. Quality of life of CML patients is a challenge because many patients suffer, and I assume that you as a GIST patient taking also drugs similar to what we take, you know what side effects they have. There is no drug without side effect, so they influence quality of life for quite a large population of the patients. And I think for us as a big international community, access to treatment is one of the biggest challenges. There are still today CML patients in many countries, low and middle income countries, who do not have access to treatment, especially those when they develop resistance, don't have access to second generation and third generation drugs. They are still on the patent, they are still expensive. And for us as a global community, it's one of the biggest responsibility to fight and to bring access to patients to make sure they don't die now in 2021 and forward from CML, from the disease. So my friend Norman, look at the picture. I think that's when we met. When we had one of our first meetings, the first one was when Novartis decided to gather CML and GIST advocates from various countries into the first place was in Diessenhofen in Switzerland. And I think we can see also Dimitri, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm right, he was also on your call today, still talking and taking care of GIST patient. And this was one of the first meetings we had together when the community of globally advocates, I think there were at the first meeting about 9 GIST advocates, 15 CML advocates at the first meeting in Switzerland. We met for 3 days and to discuss our diseases and how to empower the advocacy groups around the world. So that was the first meeting, and since then Novartis started doing every year CML and GIST Horizons, where we met together. And the number of advocacy grew every year. We had more and more patient organizations join us. But I think in 2008 or 9, Novartis decided that they cannot organize anymore a single sponsored company conference like this. And they asked us, the community, to take responsibility for organizing Horizons. And I think you remember, Norman, the meeting we had, I think it was in Portugal, that we sat, or in Spain, I'm not sure, one of these two countries, we sat and we had a steering committee of 6 GIST advocates and 6 CML advocates, and we discussed how do we take the responsibility to drive Horizons and building the community together. We decided to split, and I'm sure that you'll talk about the consequences of the split when the GIST community decided to organize GIST Horizon by themselves, and we, the CML community, decided to organize CML Horizon by ourselves. So it happens so that GIST Horizon is organized today, and in 2 days, in Friday, I'm organizing the CML Horizon for the 19th consecutive years. But we met every year, 25, 35, 40 advocates, and for 3 days we interacted. It was a great meeting, but then we went home and there was no interaction among us. And then the CML community decided 4 advocates, including my friend Jan Geisler from Germany and Jana from Czech Republic, to build a network, global network of CML patient organization. And the intention was to have a directory of all the CML patient organization available. So if a CML patient is diagnosed in one country, he can look at the list at the website and find a close CML support group. To build a social media platform where all the advocates can interact among themselves, ask questions and share best practices, to build skills to the advocates to coordinate awareness campaigns for the disease, for the treatment, build partnership with other communities which are doing very much so, especially in Europe, and to share the knowledge of each one. So we started, as we said, around 30 groups. At the time we split, there were 30, 35 CML patient organizations at the time that we started doing it alone around in 2010. And today, in 2021, the network consists of 126 CML patient organizations from 95 countries, and it is really considered one of the strongest communities, patient advocates communities around there. So what are we doing as a CML Advocates Network community? So one of the things that we are doing is to doing patient-led research for patients to understand what is the perspective of patients about, especially about issues like I've mentioned before. Adherence was one of them. And stopping treatment, like I have stopped, there are many other patients who stopped, but we feel that the doctors do not understand the perspective of the patients or why they are not taking the drugs and what are they feeling when they stop treatment. So I was lucky enough to lead 2 global researchers, one on adherence, on non-adherence of CML patients with more than 2,500 patients from 63 countries, and on TFR stopping treatment with more than 1,000 patients in 68 countries. Those were very interesting studies, researchers. They were published in leading scientific magazines, the last one on stopping treatment in leukemia, one of the leading scientific magazines in the world. These studies were presented at scientific meetings like ASH and EHA, and we really appreciate that the doctors are welcoming us and learning from us. We have started a concept which is called CAB, Community Advisor Board, with companies to improve access to treatment, which is a big challenge. You know that many of us advocates participate in advisory board that is organized by companies, and they invite whoever they want and set up the agenda and decide which topic they want to discuss. And we come there, we give them our perspective as advocates, then we go home. We never know what are they adapting from whatever we recommended to them. It's all in their hand and they decide what to do. So we decided to change the concept, and it was built on the HIV community experience. We built a community advisory board where we, the community, set up the agenda. We set up the invitation who will be participate both from the advocate side and also from the pharma company, each company separately, and we are discussing topics and finding solution to access and to next topic is participating in the drug development program. This is something we never dreamt 20 years ago that can happen, that people like me and my colleagues and my friends will be sitting on an advisory board of leading investigators in the world and working together to develop better drugs, more patient-friendly drugs, to make sure that you don't only make drugs, but you make drugs that patients are willing and happy to take them. So this is happening today, and it's becoming what we call a win-win situation, both for the community, the patient advocate community, and also for the pharma. And more companies are adopting these concepts. And we are working very closely with the CML hematologist groups like the ICMLF and the EI, European Investigator CML Group. We participate in their meeting. We are sitting together with them on the working groups and making sure that whatever can be done to improve the outcome of CML patient is done together. And education of empowerment of patient and advocates. The CML Horizon is one example that we are organizing every year now for 19 years. But there are many other things that we are doing to empower all the patient advocates, are members of the network. So in summary, we very much appreciate the excellent progress made in CML and GIST therapy, thanks to very well coordinated research. And the worldwide CML Advocate Network with 126 group is certainly a key partner for research. CML has turned into a chronic disease. Today, a CML patient can live a lifespan of a healthy person in a similar age, but the emphasis today is also on the quality of life of the patients. And that's why, because of all the challenges I've listed, we need more. We certainly need cure. And most important, we need to keep the hope. We need to keep the dream. Yes, and I still have a dream. And Norman, my friend, I hope that in few years, you and me will be organized a webinar like this when we can discuss the cure that was already found for CML and GIST patients. And I thank my Israeli patients and the global CML community for giving me the strength and to continue to dream. And thank you for listening.
Okay, so Matthew, if you will pull up my slides, and then we'll have a few minutes, Giora and I, at the end. So Sarah charged me with taking a look at something called, what are the lessons that we have learned so far in a 20-year period of time? And I decided not to talk so much about all the drugs and all the tests and what have you, because we have so many experts and so many scientists participating who are doing it. So let me talk about what I think are the takeaway lessons, certainly that I've learned so far from the perspective of the GIST community. My first slide. First lesson I've learned is that science is very hard. This is not like planting a crop in the field. This is not like drawing a photograph. It's hard. And the second lesson is that cancer science is very hard. And finally, the third lesson I learned in terms of science is drum roll, Matthew, that rare cancer science is daunting, because we have to get enough numbers together at any point in time to understand what's going on. Let's go to the next slide. So decided, let's take a look at the culture of cancer and what is it that distinguishes this culture from other cultures. The first interesting thing to me is that cancer is not contagious. And the result is, the consequence is, it's usually in society not urgent. Let's take a look at something. In the year 2020, let's take a look at two different diseases. COVID-19, which is dominating all of our time and attention in the world, in the year 2020, there were 345,000 cases. In the same year, there were almost 600,000 cancer cases. How many headlines did we hear about cancer versus how many did we hear about COVID in exactly the same year? Next slide. The second thing, and George Dimitri started talking about this earlier today, is that the culture of cancer is designed in a way, not intentionally, that it's not collaborative. And one of the reasons is there are too many stakeholders. I gave a talk years ago to a group of oncologists, and I said to them, if they were responsible, if the cancer community was responsible for the Manhattan Project, and those of you who are much younger than me and Giora may not know, the Manhattan Project was created in the 1940s by the Americans to create in a few years an atomic bomb, which they succeeded in doing. And what I told these oncologists was, if this were a group of cancer researchers, the world would be nuclear free, because you never could have gotten together and collaborate the way these researchers did. So what are the cultures? We have pharmaceutical executives, we have pharmaceutical scientists, not the same group of people, and we have pharmaceutical investors who want to know how much money they've earned from what the company has done recently. We have government regulators and we have government researchers. We have individual researchers, and we have research publishers. That's an interesting group of people. You don't think about them. A group of patients lend their lives to a clinical trial. The data is collected from the trial by the researcher. The researcher turns the data over to a publisher. And if you, the patient, want to read a copy of your trial, you have to pay the publisher for a copy of your result. And if the data does not make it to the research publisher, you don't see it. There are foundations, there are patient advocacy organizations, there are hospitals. Let me pause at the word hospital. I give a course called 10 Steps to Survive Cancer. And one of the steps, as silly as it may sound, is stay the hell out of the hospital, because they're very dangerous, uncoordinated places. Finally, we have clinicians and we have individual doctors, doctor after doctor after doctor. When I talk to a patient, one of the first things I ask the patient is, who is your doctor? Is it your oncologist? Is it your surgeon? Is it your neurologist? Who is it? And then there are, behind the scenes, probably one of the most dominant factors of all in terms of all these stakeholders, there are our insurers. Are they willing to pay for what all these other people have done? And finally, if we were to have a drum roll, finally, at the end of the list, there are patients and there are caregivers. Next slide. So what happened? We put together a secret army. And I'm identifying here just a few members of this secret army over this 20-year period. People may know about some, but not about all. So the first one is, we had this crazy doctor called George Dimitri. He's with us today. And he decided to help as many patients as he possibly could, thinking out of the box, in our case, who were just patients. We had some interesting researchers, and one of them I cite is a guy named Dr. Lee Hellman. Dr. Lee Hellman was the chief scientist for the National Institute of Health, National Cancer Institute. And he and I are sitting at an ASCO meeting one day next to each other. And I said, you know, Lee, it really would make sense. We were looking at the time at wild type GIST that affected a relatively small subset of all of the GIST patients, mostly younger people. Said, how come, Lee, you don't have a clinic down at the NIH where all these patients can come to one clinic and you collect information? And Lee Hellman turned to me and said, you know, Norman, that's a good idea. So help me God, that was the entire planning discussion. He created a clinic at the NIH, which brought together people from all over the world and continues to do so. Then we had a group of people who I call my innovators. And the innovators affected CML as well as GIST and other people. It's a guy named Gil Friedman. Gil Friedman was kind of a misplanted Israeli who decided one day to create something called a listserv that any patient group can use, called ACOR. And that listserv existed so that when a group of patients came along, 2 patients, 10 patients, or what have you, not much money, not much organization, they had a place on the internet, an infrastructure that had already been created where they could talk to each other. We had some interesting politicians. I'll introduce one to you in a little while. One of them was a guy named Ted Kennedy. And then we came across an interesting scientist, a guy named James Watson. And I remember having lunch with James Watson out at Cold Springs Harbor. I'll tell you a minute, and for those of you who don't know who he is. And he was introduced to me originally by a guy named Dan Vasella, who I'll talk about in a minute. And James Watson and a guy named Crick were the co-inventors of something called DNA, the secrets of the meaning of life. And then, by the way, he happened to have a house at the time at Cold Springs Harbor in Long Island. It's this huge structure that had been built by an artist of his double helix. Watson won the Nobel Prize for his invention. And if you look at Dan Vasella's book talking about Gleevec, there are 3 people on the back cover of that book. One is this guy, George Dimitri. The other is me. I don't know how the hell I got there. And the third is the Nobel Prize winner, James Watson. And finally, George Dimitri mentioned as well, there's this pharmaceutical executive, guy named Dan Vasella. And what was unusual about Dan Vasella is that he was a medical doctor, and he had a philosophy of running an organization. By the way, he was a tough son of a bitch. If you talk to people in Nevada's about what would happen when Dan Vasella came to a meeting, wanted to know what's going on, he didn't fool around. But he had a philosophy, and his philosophy was, good science makes good research. Let's follow the science. And one of the things that he followed one day was his drug STI 571. And finally, we had an advocacy group like the Raft group and so on. The Secret Army was much broader in this, but these are some of the key players. So the next slide. So here are some of the characters. So reading from right to left, there is Ted Kennedy and Dan Vasella and Norman Scherzer. Why are we sitting there? We're sitting in the living room of the guy in Boston, who is the president of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And Novartis was there announcing the opening of their research facility in Cambridge. So it wasn't, we were in Boston, but we were opening a facility in Cambridge. And there were 3 keynote speakers that day, or 2 keynote speakers that day. One was Ted Kennedy and one was Norman Scherzer. How we got to be there was interesting, but it was a tribute to the Raft group that we were invited. And in the middle is this guy named James Watson, Nobel Prize winner. We're having lunch together. Those people who know me know that I can talk forever. I can tell stories forever. James Watson turned to me and said, can you tell me a little bit, Norman, about the genetic structure of this disease called GIST? And I was spellbound. That a Nobel Prize winner who discovered DNA wanted me to explain to him the scientific structure of GIST. And it took me about 5 minutes just to get my thoughts together. And there on the left is Norman Scherzer, George Dimitri, and this guy, Gil Friedman. Gil Friedman was so certain that it was important that Norman Scherzer, the head of an organization that we had a handful of members, and Dimitri get together, that he arranged the meeting and paid for me to fly to Dana-Farber to meet George Dimitri. Next slide. The culmination of this, of what this group of people did, came to be when Dan Vasella, the CEO of Novartis, retired, and I was invited to come to Basel, Switzerland, as the only non-Novartis employee to speak at Dan Vasella's retirement event. And what Dan Vasella had to say surprised me. We had years before presented data to Novartis where we compared the actual dosage that people were on to the intent to treat dosage that's used in calculating how people are doing clinical trials. Intent to treat means starting dosage. And without going into this complex arrangement of intent to treat versus actual dosage, the LifeRaft group discovered that higher dosages made a difference for many people. And we had presented the data to Novartis. And what Dan Vasella had to say was really kind of a culmination of what is it that pharmaceutical companies think about the data that's put together by patient advocacy groups. And what he had to say was that we had collected all this data, we had come to Novartis, he had looked at what we said, and most important, he says, and you know what? He was right and he was wrong. The data had to be higher. So here's the head, the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, saying, and there were about 75,000 people listening remotely to his retirement remarks, that the work of a patient advocacy group produced data that was correct. Next slide. We have some unfinished business. First of all, in the world of traditional research, we need to bring researchers together to find an effective treatment for children. And these are the patients, children and young adults, who have something called wild-type GIST. This is the commitment that we made as guest speakers at Vice President Biden's Cancer Summit. Second major priority is we need to figure out better ways to overcome the resistance that patients encounter on different types of GIST treatments. And similar to what Giora finished up with regard to CML, we need to find a cure. Next slide. Now, the other half of our unfinished business is kind of the side that receives a lot less attention. We need to close the lethal time gap between scientific advancement and best practices. We need to be able to connect the pertinent diagnostic test to the right targeted drug. We need to make sure that drug is available to the patient community. It's authorized in a particular country. We need to make sure that it's affordable to the patient community. We need to help the patient manage the side effects in taking that drug. And finally, we need to confirm and help the patient actually take that drug. And I want to talk about that for a moment. Many years ago, I worked for the Centers for Disease Control. And we did a study. We wanted to know whether or not people could take an oral antibiotic. So we did a study to see, could the average patient complete 10 days of an oral antibiotic, 10 days? And the answer was no. The average patient got to about 7 days. We're in the position, many of us, where we want a patient to complete 365 days of an oral drug whose side effects are much worse than the side effects that one experiences with an antibiotic. And I think that the issue of adherence, it's kind of like the iceberg that's out there, that in many cases, patients are failing treatment and not responding to treatment, not because the treatment doesn't work, but because they are unable to take this drug consistently on a day-to-day basis. So that's the lethal time gap. Next slide. So if I had to define one thing that enables patients to survive cancer, one thing that enables the Life Raft group to proceed the way we have, it's persistence. You know, you get knocked down, you pick it up, and you go again. You get knocked down, you pick it up, and you go and you do it again. We have a mantra in the Life Raft group that if we encounter somebody who tells us something that we don't like, Norman, we're sorry, we can't make this drug available. What we say, what all of our staff are trained to say is, we understand, but that's unacceptable. We want to go on and on and on. So there's an interesting thing about persistence, and it's going to lead to the last slide. This is what persistence sometimes achieves. Matthew. So it's me and Sarah getting our photo taken after attending a meeting with the guy who became the president of the United States of America. That's what persistence achieved. And I think that's the last slide, Matthew. So if we can bring my friend Giora back, can we split the screen between us, Sarah?
I think that's the magic with Matt.
So one of the amazing things about this horrible pandemic that we are going through around the world in both our countries and what have you is the ability to hold meetings like this, where we can sit together with relatively ease and what have you. I think the last count, Sarah, was that we had patients attending from 25 countries. And I think that what we're finding is that what we've learned in surviving this pandemic has in fact transformed medicine throughout the world. So I'm going to tell a quick story, and then I want Giora to share his remarks. And Sherry, you'll give us a shout out because I think we only have a few minutes. So one of the stories in terms of persistence, I call this story my Israeli miracle. We had a patient many years ago, and the patient had failed Gleevec and needed to have access to the second line drug called Sutent that was at that time in clinical trials in a number of places, but we saw it was working. And the patient's family contacted us and said that the trial had been, the hospital in Israel, large hospital in Israel that was to host this trial, had not yet started a trial, and 2.5 months had already gone by waiting for the trial to start. And at the request of the family, we sent a letter to the president of the Israeli hospital. And we told the president of this hospital that we understood that he had to have due diligence before you rush into a trial, and we appreciate all of that. But we wanted him to understand something else, that we intended to hold him personally responsible for the death of this patient, should this patient die waiting for this trial to begin. And in less than 8 hours, we heard from 3 lawyers for this particular hospital in Israel, threatening to sue me for defamation of character. But the story was that the very next morning, the family called us and said they had just heard from the equivalent, I don't know whether it's the right title, they had heard from the Israeli Cancer Society, and they were told that the trial had just begun. And we call this a miracle in Israel. What are your thoughts as we sit together and try to wrap up our first day of an extraordinary meeting with colleagues from all over the world that we know and that we love?
Well, I think I have a couple of points I would like to tell you. You call it persistence, and I call it another word. I call it chutzpah. And I think maybe Sarah or you can better explain what chutzpah means. Because I don't know any person in the world that can go for the most expensive breakfast that any CEO has ever paid, to go to a breakfast with Dan Vazela and come out with a check, I don't even want to say the number of how many $1 million, for all to be invested into research in GIST patients. And I don't know anybody else beside you who could have done that. And you call it persistent, I call it chutzpah. And you know that we have many stories like this, that you have to go out of the normal, out of the regular, think about things that somebody else will never think about, and then you can achieve things like you have done, and we as a CML community have done also. The second thing I want to tell you, it's very nice to see you on the screen here right in front of me. We are splitting screens, one for you, one for me. This doesn't mean that we are not you're not going to invite me anymore for the Chinese dinner at the in Chinatown in New York. I'm not, one time was not enough. And remember, you promised me, and Sarah, I take you count for that. You promised to put Norman on a one-way ticket from the US to Tel Aviv. And I'll wait for him because there is a long list of persons I want you to have breakfast here in Israel with. So we are waiting for you.
Thank you, my friend. So maybe, Sarah, I can just share the story that he's talking about, and then we can wrap things up, or I'll leave it to you whether you have any questions. So the lunch with Dan with Seller, that was an unusual lunch. And what I said to him over lunch that day was, I'd like to start a research team, and I'd like you to give me some seed money to get it going. He says, what do you have in mind? He said, I'd like you to give me $1,650,000. And he looked at me, Giora, the way you're looking at me now, like, yeah. He says, so where does that number come from, Norm? I said, it's 0.25% of your gross revenues from Gleevec last year. And he looked at me, probably was a minute. I thought it was like 30 minutes. And he finally says to me, he says, Norman, I don't like your formula, but I'll give you $2 million. And I left the luncheon, and what was surprising about the luncheon was we shook hands on it, and I was afraid to wash my hands. I had no evidence that how do I get it? Do you ship it to me? Do I get a check? Do I knock on the door of Novartis in New Jersey or what have you? But that's the story of how our research funding got started. And I'd like to tell you that it was very difficult to do, but it turned out it made sense to me, and it certainly made sense to him. Well, I'll tell you one more thing. There's a difference between CEOs of pharmaceutical companies. When the Life Raft Group was a couple of months old, we asked Dan Vasella to write an article for our newsletter. And he said, sure, and he wrote an article for our newsletter. Fast forward, it's a couple of years later, and the CEO, one of his counterparts for another pharmaceutical company, that I'll leave nameless, sends me I get an email from him. The email says, please take me off the mailing list for your newsletter. 2 CEOs, 2 major companies, one writes an article, and one says, take me off your mailing. He didn't have to he could have thrown the paper in the garbage. But the second CEO had no sense that working with patients is good business. We're your customers.
So
Sarah, I'm going to let you decide how long you want Giora and I to talk.
We're going to conclude the meeting very soon. I just want to open up the floor if anybody has any reflections. We've just completed day 1 of New Horizons, where we reflected on the 20-year history for the GIST community. And VG, I think I see you popping up. Maybe you want to share your experiences. VG, from our friend from India, has been with us during this journey as well. So welcome, VG.
It's such an emotional moment, and I know that it is never very professional to work from the heart, but each and every person here puts their heart before everything else. And that is why 20 years is a long time. 20 years is a lifetime. And so much can happen in 2 decades. Like Giora said, CML and GIST, strange bedfellows, Gleevec brought us together. A passion for our patient community brought us together. Today here, I am seeing patients, I'm seeing caregivers, peers, advocates, treating physicians. What a marvelous group we are. I am extremely proud and extremely honored And also, like Norman and Giora both said, I cannot wait for the pandemic to be behind us so that next time we meet, we hug each other, we go out to dinner, lunch, whatever with each other, and we only grow stronger and stronger. Thank you, Sarah, and everybody at Life Raft for bringing us all together like this. Thank you so much.
If I may, Norman, just say a word about Vigi. We both know Vigi. I think she was with us from the beginning. But I'm not sure that everybody knows the amazing work that Vigi and the Max Foundation is doing in India, and how many thousands and thousands of life of CML and GIST patients they have saved with the GPAP program that was started many, many years ago with support of Novartis. Many people owe their life to Vigi and her counted friends that are doing amazing work in a very difficult country like India. So thank you, Vigi.
BG, share with everybody what I call you whenever I send messages to you. I want everyone to know, what is it that I call you, BG?
Norman calls me his Indian princess.
That's correct.
Well, I'm really happy that Giora acknowledged the wonderful work that VG and the Max Foundation has done. And I think that's actually a really good transition, because tomorrow we are going to be talking about current treatment options and really focusing on what's going on in present day. And there will be a focus on access issues and best practices for solutions. And I know the Max Foundation is going to be participating that day, and their contribution during the discussion would be very valuable. So I want to thank everybody today for attending and for the presentations and everybody's contributions and input. Thank you to the stories of the survivors who have contributed to give everybody hope today, that there is hope on the horizon. And we look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. It is the same link. We will be sharing the link again, so you get that reminder. But thank you, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great day.
Good night, everybody.
Shalom, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.
See you.